All right, welcome everyone to the next session for the Carbon Positive Reset teach-in. This is Achieving Zero, Codes and Policies for Net Zero Emissions in New and Existing Building Operations. For those of you that are applying for continuing education credits, either through the AIA or one of your industry organizations, this is the description and learning objectives for the session. We will follow up with a survey via email after the teach-in to collect some critical information for helping us process your continuing education credits. So keep a lookout for that after the teach-in. I am extremely pleased to have with us two wonderful presenters as part of this panel to talk about codes and policies. My name is Vincent Martinez. I'm the moderator for today's session. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Architecture 2030. I'm joined by Dr. Zhang from the China Academy for Building Research. He's the director there, and he's going to speak to us about the nearly net zero plus on and off site renewables standard that you heard Ed Mazria talk about in the opening keynote. And we're also going to hear from Sumedha Malaviya, manager at World Resource Institute India, who's going to talk about some of the work that's been going on in one of the cities in India for decarbonization and energy efficiency. So I will pass it on to Dr. Zhang to get us started.
Okay. So here in Beijing now is 5 p.m. in the afternoon, and I'm very glad to join this video conference to share our latest progress on the topic of zero energy building in China. Previously, Professor Ed and our academy, we have a collaboration history about 8 years. We are all the partners of the APEC, Asia Pacific Energy Economy Zero Energy Building Program. And in that program, we have set up a strong relationship to share the informations, the latest informations, and to promote this idea. And last week, we just, in this program, we published 3 books, and the books was downloaded in the APEC website for more than 10,000 times. And last week, we just published a journal paper talking about how to achieve zero energy building in Asia Pacific region till year 2050. And in this seminar, I would like to take 15 minutes to share how we promote this idea in China. And as Vincent already introduced, Ed may introduce our China building energy standards in the opening session. Actually, last year by Ministry of Housing and Urban Rural Development, who is a code management organization in China, they published a technical standard. We call this technical standards nearly zero energy building technical standard. And this standard was edited by more than 40 research organizations and design studios for last 3 years. And after that, the ministry accepted this technical standard and to publish it to all the building architects and engineers. And in this standard, because in China, previously, the first building energy code was issued in 1986, which is already 30 years before. And after that, the building energy codes in China upgraded by 3 times, once every 10 years. So for this first nearly zero energy building standard, how to lead the building energy towards zero, this should be linked with the previous standards. And also it should be linked with the international consensus definitions and technology roadmaps. So that's why That's why we think about this national standard. So in this standard, we set up a very clearly controlled indicator in the energy consumption index of public buildings and of residential buildings. And besides the energy consumption criteria, we also have the requirements for the indoor air quality. This is two mandatory requirements. And one of the most important thing in this national standard is it proposed 3 terms and 3 definitions and 3 technology roadmaps that linked with each other from what we are now towards a zero energy building. So these 3 terms was named by ultra low energy building, nearly zero energy building, and zero energy building. So the ultra low energy building have energy percentage of 50% energy reduction compared with the existing level now. And nearly zero have 60 to 75%. And the zero energy building was the same as the zero carbon building, which Professor Edwards defined. So these are the 3 steps from what we are now till the year 2050. And so the mandatory building energy codes, what we suggested should follow this voluntary building energy standards to upgrade it in the next decades till ultra low, until nearly zero, and until zero energy in the year 2050. This is the first voluntary standards that could lead the industry. And besides these standards, the China central government also set up 13th five-year research program that was led by our academy, and the research funding was more than 100 million, which is about 20 million USD. And altogether, there are 29 research organizations together to promote this nearly zero energy building idea in the whole China. Besides that, the central government also issued some incentive policies and mid to long-term goals of this kind of building. For example, in the Ministry of Housing and Urban Rural Development, in the 13th five-year plan, the total target of ultra low energy building and nearly zero energy building was 10 million square meters, and which by now we already have more than 12 million square meters already exist now in China. Why this ultra low energy building and nearly zero energy building progress very quickly is because that from provincial level government and the city level government also have special incentives and special supporting policies to promote this kind of building. For example, the volume ratio reward for real estate developer, if you design and construct this kind of building, and you could have a 10% volume ratio reward. And some of the government also cover the incremental cost of this kind of building when you use high efficiency building envelopes or building energy systems. So in the last 5 years, the nearly zero energy building in China grows very fast from cold region, which is in the middle of China, to the warm region and to the severe cold region, and from single buildings to the community level demonstration, and also from small pilot projects like 2,000 to 3,000 to 20,000 to 30,000 single building, so huge building. So here is incremental that show in the last 7 years that you could see in China. This increased very fast, and we do the testing. We do the testing of some of the existing buildings, which could show a 70% energy reduction in the annual energy consumption of nearly zero energy building compared with the average building. And also this kind of building have a very high efficiency, which is more than 50% in the building walls and in the building windows, and also in the building energy system. And in China, because this kind of building could influence the total energy consumption in the building sector, and because the energy efficiency funding usually in China is for buildings, for the industries, and for the transportations, and for the appliances, and the equipment. So if we want to try to persuade the government officers that to promote the nearly zero energy building, we could fight with the climate change, and it could better for our energy system and for the future of the energy. So what we do is we calculated the scenarios of energy reduction potential to year 2050. This is the energy consumption calculation model that we use the building floor area and together with the building energy intensity from now to nearly zero building, and we could see how much we could be saved. And we make the prediction of the building floor areas for both residential buildings and for the commercial buildings in the 5 climate zones, because the building energy consumption was different in different climate zones, which is a severe cold region, the cold region, and hot summer, warm winter, and hot summer, cold winter, and temperate. These are the 5 climate zones which was shown here. And the building floor area was predicted by every 5 years, from 2020 to 2050. And the energy intensity of zero energy building was predicted here, which is followed by the nearly zero energy building standard I introduced in the first slide. And for the different scenarios, we predicted 5 scenarios, from slow to moderate to the leapfrog, which is we could promote a zero energy building as much as we could. And so we could see the building energy consumption capacity till the year 2050 is that if we promote the zero energy building with much more effort and the peak demand of the whole building China industry could occur earlier. And one conclusion is that in generally, only if the percentage of ultra low energy and nearly zero energy is larger than 50%, whatever is new building or is retrofit building, in totally 60 billion square meters of the China's building and construction industry, and the total energy consumption in China that could decrease, only this occur. So because previously when we communicated in email that my presentation time is about 12 to 15 minutes, I think I could stop here, and I would like to answer your questions and for discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Zhang. We'll move on to Sumedha's presentation, and then we'll come back and do questions.
Great. Thanks again, Vincent, for this opportunity to present this particular piece of work that we have completed for the city of Kochi, which is, I mean, and providing us this platform to really talk about this work, given the fact that we are talking about achieving net zero. The speaker before me talked about some of the design standards that China has developed in the last couple of years which will take eventually the buildings towards net zero energy buildings. And in the morning, we had, heard several speakers, particularly I remember the remarks that Ed had made in his morning remarks on how government policy and incentives are needed in cities for setting targets for large buildings. But how will these be determined for a city which is in the global south? What enablers are needed? The chief enabler is, of course, data. And today I'm going to share our experience and basically an understanding of how prepared are our Indian cities in terms of committing for these targets on zero carbon buildings. So just a quick note on, what Kochi is like. So Kochi is the second largest urban agglomeration in the state of Kerala. It's a tourist center. 27% of the city is covered by water bodies and wetlands. Logically, it is a city which is quite vulnerable to floods. Since it's located in the warm and humid climate, it typically sees very high cooling degree days throughout the year. And it has both a solar city, and it has also been both a solar city and a smart city. So looking at policy convergence, these two aspects became quite important for us for the selection of Kochi as one of the cities that we wanted to work with for the zero carbon building roadmap. As the city has grown, so has the architecture of the buildings. The examples that I provided here are from traditional architecture of houses in Kerala, which look at very natural daylighting as well as ventilation strategies. But as is the case with many cities globally, the inspiration from the Western sort of, architecture and design sensibilities, there has been a gradual change in this particular climate responsive traditional architecture in Kerala towards more glass facade-based buildings. So be it the apartment complexes that are coming up in Kochi or the offices in Kochi, they are looking at more and more, aesthetics using glass. But of course, these has implications. And as I mentioned, Kochi is a coastal city, and it saw a very severe event in 2018 where with a lot of damage to house and of lives and property in the state of Kerala in 2018. And I would say that that kind of changed things as far as the public discourse on climate change is concerned. Many new initiatives and programs were launched to address the issue of vulnerability and resilience of the state. And down here is the mayor of the Kochi Corporation, who agreed and concurred when we went forward with the proposal that why don't we look at developing this trajectory for zero carbon buildings for the city. And given that this was right, after the floods, there was a lot of interest in the mayor to commit to something like this. And she made publicly known that they are interested in working on this roadmap with us on looking at zero carbon buildings. Given the fact that zero carbon buildings have been found to be attainable in India, we have had examples of both office spaces and residential buildings and industrial spaces as well, which have met net zero energy building standards, but these are quite few. And while these are technically attainable, we wanted to look at how these can be scaled up and what will it look like if the city was to sort of take up something like this. So we went ahead with these following research questions. Where is the current building stock on the road to zero carbon, which would essentially imply understanding the building stock of the city and the building energy used by different building typologies. Where are the large buildings on the road to zero carbon? And by large, I am referring to a certain category of buildings which have a connected load of greater than 100 kilowatts, specifically because the Energy Conservation Building Code of India covers these buildings. And we have the large residential buildings as well. And finally, what should be the zero carbon building targets for Kochi's priority building typology? So what should be the top 2 to 3 building typologies that the city must prioritize, which should be converted to zero carbon in a phased manner? Now, all of this sounded really good on paper. And, as far as the theoretical understanding is concerned, we went ahead with a very detailed methodology of, understanding the building sector, collecting data on the building stock and building typologies, understanding the electricity consumption in buildings, given the fact that electricity is the largest final energy use in buildings. Our efforts were mostly focused on the electricity side, establishing the baseline energy performance for both existing and new buildings. A request that had come from the mayor of the corporation, as well as a stakeholder committee that we had established, that we also look at both existing buildings and new buildings, given that Kochi does have a very large stock of old heritage architecture buildings as well. Finally, identifying energy efficiency measures for existing and new buildings, developing these reference models for different building typologies, analyzing the techno-economic feasibility of energy conservation measures, primarily which are mentioned in the Energy Conservation Building Code, and finalizing these options for introducing these options in both existing and new buildings, and developing an action plan for achieving these goals. And throughout this process, we were supported by a very able team of experts and stakeholders which were interested in this process of really contributing. So pretty much the entire process was extremely bottom up instead of top down, giving us the opportunity to understand what could be the future implementation challenges if something like this was to be imposed top down. We also established our definition for zero carbon. As I had mentioned, that we looked at electricity, so we also had to be realistic and feasible about what could be done at the city scale. So our definition did not consider off-site renewables, because currently we do not have regulatory support for off-site renewables in India. We especially for residential buildings. For commercial buildings it's available, but not for residential buildings. We did not account for energy used in cooking, transportation, and the diesel used in backup power generation, and looking at achieving zero carbon at the building scale. Coming to the findings of this exercise. So looking at this particular slide where we talk about the building stock and the electricity use, one of the first things that we found is the status of the data collection on building stock. How much is being built every year, of what type, what percentage is being renovated. We were hopeful that we will get this data, but after spending months on the ground, we found this information to be quite challenging to compile, spread across different offices and not even in digital records. Pretty much a lot of this information on how many buildings are being approved every year, how many floor plans are being approved every year is captured manually and not in digital records. So we finally had to go with whatever we could find, and we were able to establish a trend looking at what the typical commercial buildings were coming up in Kochi. We found that there were more commercial buildings coming up than residential buildings. On the energy use side, we found that the residential electricity use sector is significantly larger than the commercial building space, but it is growing at a much slower rate. And looking at the sort of split of electricity consumption across different buildings, we found that 33% of the large buildings, that is the ones which are above 100 kilowatts, were occupied by offices, and followed by retail outlets or shops, and then lastly by apartment complexes. So if we look at the pathway to zero carbon buildings for commercial buildings, we basically went with modeling the baseline typologies with the measures that were mentioned in the Energy Conservation Building Code of 2017. This code also allows for both integration of renewable energy with the energy efficiency measures. And we found that achieving ECBC and its two other levels of compliance, ECBC plus and super ECBC, does fall short of achieving zero carbon. So you can achieve a reduction of up to 59% when you apply super ECBC, but the on-site renewable energy that is mandated for that particular level is about 6%. It's not sufficient to meet, to completely decarbonize at the building scale. And if we look at residential buildings, there the challenge was even much more, it was much larger. This is something that we have also experienced in India, that defining building typologies for the residential sector is quite difficult and a very time intensive activity. So our analysis as far as residential buildings was limited because of these aspects of establishing these reference building typologies for residential. So we modified our approach, and since we wanted to still understand what is the energy performance of buildings anyway, we conducted a small survey of about 250 independent dwellings across different bedroom categories, and found that the EPI ranged anywhere between 20 to 26 units per meter square. It looked small to us and gave us the hope that there is potential to achieve zero carbon with on-site renewable energy for at least these medium high income independent dwellings. And at the time of this work, the ECBC residential had just been released. So we could look at some of the requirements that could be incorporated into some of the guidelines for resulting in the reduction in the energy demand between 40 and 60%, putting them on a path to nearly zero carbon trajectory. But technically answering this question of zero carbon for other residential building typologies remained a challenge for us. And if we look at just sort of summarizing the key findings, so as I mentioned before, that even though the ECBC mandates fall short of zero carbon, compliance with these codes is necessary to put the new commercial buildings on a zero carbon building trajectory. For new residential buildings, we need to do much more than just sort of, just looking at the building, not just understanding what the building typologies are, but it needs much more understanding of the technical requirements that need to come into picture for residential buildings. If we have to look at which buildings to prioritize, probably the new public buildings should be prioritized first. And since zero carbon cannot be achieved completely on site, we have to look at neighborhood or ward or portfolio scale approaches. This is also a recommendation that came from our expert committee, which was quite keen that we do not neglect the fact that we are talking about the built environment overall and just focus our efforts on building energy use, but also look at energy use related to buildings. So whether it's transportation, waste management, etc., they should also be a part of the calculation. Finally, despite these challenges and because of the requests of the mayor and the experts and the stakeholders that we consulted, they agreed on setting this kind of an ambitious vision for Kochi. So having, all new government buildings become zero carbon by 2030, all new residential buildings to become zero carbon by about 2035. And given the concern regarding embodied carbon, we also proposed whether all buildings should be put on a path to zero carbon, both operational and embodied carbon by 2045. And of course, looking at portfolio and ward scale approaches for achieving net zero carbon is something that needs to be explored. But when we look at the needed actions in the near term, and here we spent a lot of time going back and forth between different stakeholders, trying to identify what has been some of the challenges in doing this exercise and what can be improved further for building this case for a pathway to zero carbon. One of these are some of the top recommendations and the top stakeholders that need to be involved and their application across buildings. I'll speak about two of these. One is the improvement needed in the data collection on building stock. This is, as I mentioned, has been one of the major gaps as far as Indian cities is concerned. There is no single authority or agency that maintains this data. It tends to be spread across different divisions, and also to some extent the knowledge and the awareness on how this data can be used is also lacking. So we have proposed that at least at the beginning, if we can start doing some sort of biannual energy audits for buildings with a larger connected load, and that could be a beginning at understanding the building scale energy use, and at the same time build capacity of the people on the ground to understand and monitor this kind of data. we're looking at implementation of demonstration projects. I saw that Professor Zhang had mentioned about the rise in the number of demonstration projects in China every year. Unfortunately, in the case of India, we do not really have enough demonstration projects to really build a solid foundation for the sort of transition that we are talking about. So more and more of these are needed, particularly in different climatic contexts. Since we have mentioned, low carbon also requires an understanding of embodied carbon, we need to look at financing options and ways in which embodied carbon can also be addressed. Some of the easier things that corporations and municipalities can do is introducing prescriptive requirements for different types of buildings and promoting on-site renewable energy generation. And in the medium term, we have proposed whether, since existing buildings is still a concern for most of the city, can we have something on the lines of what New York is doing, a retrofit accelerator, and some of the agencies which could be involved have also been described here. Finally, as far as lessons are concerned, I think this was a very good exercise for us to understand where we are as far as taking these commitments and targets is concerned. If data is a key enabler for effective policy making, Indian cities are currently not oriented towards this kind of mechanism, and there is a need for innovations in both the approaches and methodologies under data constrained scenarios. Typically, city governments do not have powers to act on energy efficiency and on-site renewables in buildings in India, but they can try to introduce smaller provisions for specific requirements, but the larger changes can be brought about by state government. And while it is important to not lose focus on decarbonizing embodied carbon, because at the city scale, if you're talking about electricity, pretty much since they typically have only one power utility, if that itself acquires 100% renewables, the city buildings will automatically become zero carbon, because it's completely decarbonized electricity that is coming. And finally, framing zero carbon buildings in the context of both mitigation and resilience is important, because I think that's what worked in our case. Because even though this typically zero carbon buildings are viewed as something from the mitigation side, but we noticed that they were also being strongly supported from our resilience experts, that this is what we need as far as energy security and energy resilience is concerned. So this is it from my side. Happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. And there's Sumedha's email address for those that have questions for her for later, but we will have Q&A now and be asking some questions, and anything that we don't cover we'll follow up via writing. I'm gonna make sure both presenters are back up on our screens. Thank you, Dr. Zhang, for answering some of the questions in the Q&A window. I'm gonna bring one of them back up for part of this dialogue, and it's related to something that Sumedha had talked about earlier, which is something that Ed mentioned at the very start of the teach-in, which was related to incentives. And Sumedha, you mentioned that that some of the municipalities or the city governments can only do so much, but they can provide incentives. Much of it has to do with state or regional governments. And Dr. Zhang, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, are there cities, are there provinces or territories, regions in China that are incentivizing the net zero standard that you're promoting out of your lab?
Yes. Yes, I answered. This is the paper that the study of China's nearly zero building incentive policies. I just submitted to Journal of Building Engineers, and in this journal paper, our team researched about 47 policies that was published on provincial level and a local level. And in our study, that we could see that all the policies have four categories. The first one is the government high-level policy, which is a high-level policy could cover several topics, like the air pollution or building or the environment. And in this kind of policy, that the near design building was raised up as one of the issue. So this is very important to our building energy efficiency because on the government level, they have a lot of priority lists that they may not concern our zero energy building as one of their priority lists. So if this zero energy building idea could be included, could be considered in a high level comprehensive government document, that was the first level A. And second is some government have the document, have the policy on the building and construction. Because in building and construction sector, it also have a lot of topics. For example, like building information modeling, for like prefabricated building. That in this kind of document, they list the zero energy building or near design building as their priority. So that's the second part. And the third level is some government, they have the special supporting policy that directly linked with our idea of near design building. And the fourth level, the level 4 is some government have they have their annual planning of how to construct and how to build. And in this kind of document, they introduce the near design building. And altogether, there are 15 directly methodology to promote this kind of building. For example, in the real estate developers, the government could have a directly funding, or could have a volume ratio reward. Or if the real estate developers, they would like to buy this land from the government, and the government required this real estate developer, you should or you must design and build a building with this energy target, not with the average target. So this is for the real estate developers. And from the user side, because the users, they always have some, they always should be linked with the bank, right? And some local governments, they have the green finance to support the end users, that they could have a low tax and low interest for the money that they buy from the bank. And some local government, they directly support the building industry that who manufactured high efficiency windows or high efficiency energy systems. So these are all the methodology that the incentive measures that the government could use to promote this kind of idea.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Zhang, for that. And the link that you provided in the chat window, we'll make sure that that's included in the question and answer on the website later so that folks can read more about that. But we're starting to see that all over the world in previous sessions too. Land use policy requirements or incentives, tax rebates or financial incentives, and then low interest loans have all been discussed in some of the other regions as well. So it's great to hear that they're common mechanisms throughout the world. Sumedha, we have a little time for you to answer that question about incentives that you saw in Kochi to drive that. And then I'd like to get to one final question if we have a moment, but we may have to answer it in the follow-up. So go ahead, Sumedha.
Sure. So I think this question of incentives is so dependent on what the city's capabilities are and how much it can really design based on its understanding. So while you have both financial and non-financial incentives available, the non-financial bit is what is in probably more control of the city. The way it works in India is that city governments still do not have a lot of the powers that they should typically have, and the kinds of mandates that they should be imposing are also diluted because of the presence of multiple agencies at the state level, and multiple approvals and bureaucratic steps that they need to take to actually pass on those incentives. So the simplest thing that we could suggest as a non-financial incentive was to look at FAR premiums, but they themselves have their limitations given the fact that high FARs are already causing a lot of of land use problems in some of the, the more dense cities, is an FAR premium a good option? So we then suggested, should we look at property tax rebates? But there also the city government, which is struggling with not being able to really do good revenue recovery, they were hesitant that, we are still sort of, our collection efficiency is not that great. Do we still provide these kinds of rebates that you're talking about? So it's still a major challenge, and I think for think tanks and CSOs like us, the work that we really need to build in is this business case. I don't like to use the word business, but it's really, why should you do this? What is the data out there on the benefits and the co-benefits of doing this? If that is made crystal clear, I think these financial, non-financial incentives will not be categorized like that. And pretty much city governments will take those decisions because they're aware of the benefits that they bring. So while we did try to convince them that, you're looking at resilience, you're looking at long-term energy security. And as I mentioned in my presentation also, the city is pretty much dependent on an electricity utility, which it doesn't control. So what is the really, my incentive in making my buildings zero carbon? Is resilience going to be my incentive? Show me the numbers, how it will benefit me. So I would say there is no straight answer yet on what these incentives could look like, but and I don't want to say, one size fits all solution. So that's why I would not propose an FAR kind of a thing for all cities. If you have the ability, then please, yeah, you can do that, but not for all cities.
Thank you very much. And you actually had a good segue for me for my next question, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I might actually, so intrigued by both your presentations, might do a follow-up, and maybe we can do a little question and answer just from some of the things I have that we can share with the audience on getting all the way to zero with the renewable side of things. But unfortunately that has to conclude our session. So I want to thank Dr. Zhang and Sumedha for joining us. We really appreciate you sharing your perspectives of what's going on in your regions. Sure, there's a lot more to talk about, and for those of you that are in attendance, we're happy to reach out and make contact for those that would like to learn more, and we'll share all the resources that were provided. So thank you both for joining us for this presentation. In conclusion, we will be moving on to the next sessions. For those of you that are interested, there is going to be a session next called Cities Lead, which is about embodied carbon policies. So feel free to take a look at that, or if you're more interested in the retrofits, there's also a session called Energy Upgraded to talk about how we're starting to see portfolios and programs and policies on energy upgrades. So thank you again for both of our presenters. We greatly appreciate it. And this concludes the session.
Thank you, Vincent.
Thank you, everyone.
Sumedha. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.